think are being tested, and as Luigi put it, quoting, that we're living in no one's world. But one of the actions that I do agree with that does pervade, especially I think a lot of the thinking amongst a significant segment, for instance on Capitol Hill, is the sense that the region is not helping themselves, that it has been too easy to come to Washington hat in hand and say, please fix this. And it can be anywhere from solve my violence problem, build me a prison, let my population stay in your country under a legal status, or whatever. Now, I say this not to be critical of our Latin friends, because Washington has contributed to this, if I call it a dependency relationship in its own way over this period of time. And in fact, it's effectively by the capitals of the hemisphere, it's a learned behavior. But nonetheless, I do think that it's testing us at this point, because there is not one construct, one strategy, one framework or reference point that we can now put the region into, which we thought we had the luxury of doing for, frankly, the last 2 decades. Whereas we talked about either in terms of security or democracy or some kind of socioeconomic development path, the region is far more complicated than that. If you look at the number of subunits or subregions, this is also another contributing factor that looks at this. At this point in time, do we talk about South America, or do we talk about Mercosur, or do we talk about UNASUR? Do we talk about the Southern Cone or the Andean region? You look at Central America or Mexico, are they one? Do we talk about them together? There's the NAFTA construct, there's the CAFTA-DR construct, there's the Caribbean island nations, there's the Caribbean basin construct, and then if you just add Venezuela to all of this, is there some Chavista axis at this point that we exist in some format or simply operates under the acronym of ALBA? So it's a little bit hard to figure out which moving piece of this you're supposed to think about at which time, and depending on how you phrase it, it creates a different reaction. If you talk about NAFTA to some, it will turn them off, and immediately you will get into the question of the cost that the region has had on the United States. If you talk about UNASUR with some, of course, they'll see it as positives. Others will just scratch their head in bewilderment and think and wonder if you don't need to get shots for it. So you have the reality of, what is the coherent or organizing element or framework at this point? The U.S. government, in my view, still operates under the perception that there is something called Latin America, that it is more unitary than not, though as Deputy Assistant Secretary Mora mentioned this morning that this administration is dealing with it at multiple levels, its own multidimensional approach to multidimensional challenges. And then there's the issue of the interplay of all of this on the inter-American architecture. I still think that there are certain notions in the body politic in this country of the organization of American states having some special place. It probably helps that it sits on a prominent corner in Washington, D.C. Some Latins point it sits in the shadow of the Washington Monument as opposed to next to it. But nonetheless, it is there, and it is something that is, again, I think generally the image is generally positive, is a residual positive image. But if you peel that away, and people who pay attention to the region, which is a small, relatively small group, then you start running into the practical problems. One of which is the OAS, for all its good intentions, has more often than not pursued member state mechanisms that overpromise and underperform. This disease, in my view, has been adopted by the Summit of the Americas process, which there should be a question about that. Further, the OAS has become the forum for the interplay between the various countries in the region over who should be a member, and again, what's the criteria. And as I will say somewhat facetiously, for many members of Congress, I think the OAS, or the Inter-American System at this point, is largely seen as an institution that serves a function little more than being a place for leaders to be able to place otherwise unemployable in-laws. So I say this despite the fact that there are many good professionals who work in the OAS and the Inter-American System who make an effort every day to fulfill the aspirations of that institution. But I think it is bordering on a serious question of whether it has any relevance at this point. I say all this not to engage in criticism or cheap shots at the region or of U.S. policy. I also don't want to dismiss that there are commonalities in the region, nor do I want to dismiss that there are many actually positive developments in the region. Unfortunately, it is the case where bad news sells in newspapers far more than anything else. Definitely not a circumstance in which we should be writing off the region. This is all the more time, in my view, why the region is actually more important to us on any number of reasons. But we are facing several, from a U.S. perspective, notable realities, political realities. Some are more easily surmounted than others, but nonetheless, they are very real and they exist. So thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Dan. That was excellent. I realize I neglected in my introduction of Carlos to mention his current position. He's now in Washington. He directs a program on international organizations and law and diplomacy at the American University School of Law. Carlos.
Thank you very much, Michael. First of all, thank you for clarifying what I'm doing now, because I'm going to talk about only in personal terms. And first of all, let me thank the organizer for the invitation to comment in this panel, Jacob and Michael Shifter, but I will mention because there are 6 institutions. It is an honor to be in a panel with Ambassador Luigi Einaudi, a person who has devoted his insightful thinking to improve the relationship with the United States and the countries of the America, and who has worked with passion, intellectual creativity, and kindness with his counterparts. Today's subject, Rethinking Hemispheric Security and Strategy, 10 years after the Mexico City U.S. declaration, is very timely in a period of deep changes, the emergence of new actors, and recurrent crises. The process that led to the Special Conference on Security held in Mexico City in October 2003 started in the second half of the 1990s, when the countries of the region developed new ideas to address security more than a decade after a long period of prevalence of military governments in several countries. The renewal of the Inter-American Security Institution and doctrines, especially in a democracy, and the adoption of confidence-building measures among the countries revealed in the late 90s the willingness to revitalize positive security relations under civilian control. The recognition of new threats to security of a very different nature led to the concept of multidimensional security, emphasizing not only the distinct causes, but also the need to find appropriate means to address them, not always military, as we have seen, or perhaps not mainly through military means. Although sub-regional institutions were recognized at the Mexico Declaration, still the main thrust of the question was seen in a hemispheric framework. But today, and I'm following what the previous speaker said, I think that the idea of region is questioned. Are we talking about the Americas, an inter-American institution, as we heard here in the morning? Or are we talking about the south of Rio Grande, Latin America? Or do we have a distinct North America, Central America, the Caribbean, and South America? If we look at the institutional landscape, we already have the OAS and the Inter-American Institution at the hemispheric level. But we also have CELAC, the Latin American Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, at the Latin American level, was created 1 year ago, and now will be going to Caracas and to Cuba in the next years. All countries of the hemisphere without the United States and Canada. At the regional level, we have the North American Free Trade Area, NAFTA, which is functioning and very well placed. We have the System of Integration of Central America, SICA. We have the CARICOM. We have the Union of South American Nations, UNASUR, and also the sub-regional level of the Common Market of the South, the Mercosur, and still we have the Andean Community. And also, as was said before, on a very different basis, we have the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, ALBA. All these claim to be regions, some sub-regions, but many claim to be regions, and are being built in a different way, but as a new identity. So if we think in hemispheric relation, we have to take into account seriously what is going on in the rest of the region to understand what are the possibilities, which I think there are, and the limits for inter-American institutions. So we have to rethink inter-American institutions in the context of a hemisphere, region in global sense, that is changing and has competing views of identity. But we do not only have institutions based on geography. This is very important to be understood. But also we have difference in how to deal with the international economy, how to integrate to globalization. And this is as important as the previous definition. We cannot have only a geographical view of the region, because that would lead to a lot of mistakes. At the end of the last century, a process of progressive opening up of several Latin American economies to the world market took place, following to different extents, and I will not go into this, the Washington Consensus. This process has had different degree of success. They were implemented by each country in particular way, to the specific realities, but in some of them, this process led to the rejection of the model, in many cases by free elections, and led to the assumption of a more closed economic model. But other countries have succeeded and have continued with this global engagement. And this is also part, and is not related to geography. So we have to be very careful in terms of understanding. And therefore, we could find also 3 and perhaps 4 models of interaction with the world economy. First, those countries that have chosen to open up their economies have for a free trade agreement with the main global markets. Mexico is a member of NAFTA, has an FTA with the European Union. Colombia has an FTA with the European Union and with the United States. Peru has an FTA with the European Union, with the United States and China. And Chile that has an FTA with the European Union, with the United States, with China, and with several other large traders. Second, we have countries that, although opened up their economies, have developed trade negotiations seeking fundamental transformation in several domains at the world level, agriculture, other goods, and have not reached agreement with larger trading countries. This is the case of Mercosur, where the leading country is Brazil, and at least Uruguay is as interested in having global trade as Brazil, and perhaps more. And we have another country that is not, has shifted its position, which is Argentina, which initially was in favor of opening up market, but now is going to the other side. Third, we have countries that are not interested at all in a free trade scheme, and those are countries belonging to ALBA. They tend to have a strong state presence in the economy and in their foreign economic relations, although there is the exception of Nicaragua, which still is part of free trade agreement and is part of ALBA. And fourth, we have Central America, Dominican Republic, and Panama that have free trade agreement with the United States and some important agreements with Europe, and also the Caribbean countries, which tend to follow a strategy of less developed countries or small islands that seek more protection due to their size. And I think that this characterization should be taken into account because it has a lot of consequences in policies and reveals different interests in international politics. And thirdly, we could also observe different approaches according to certain values. Countries that continue stressing democracy and human rights strongly. Countries that stress non-intervention as the guiding principle, and countries that tend to balance both sets of principles in their application. And I think with these three categories, we have to rethink the problem of identity. Are we Americans or Latin American? North, South, Central Americans or Caribbean Americans? Or does our model of development prevail? Or do our views of human rights and democracy? I think we have to take all of three categories of elements to work with. To what extent there is an hemispheric identity? We need to redefine that. What issues are the state participant in the inter-American system willing to deal with at this level? We cannot make the assumption that all issues are going to be treated at inter-American level. And in the field of security relations, it's true that there is less organization, but at the level of UNASUR, the Council of Ministers of Defense of UNASUR has taken a very important role, particularly has served as a forum to solve some problems in South America, and also because has now continued to develop some very important confidence-building measures. Chile and Argentina developed the question of transparency of their military budget several years ago, and now the countries of South America last month published their budgets and adopted this transparency method as a sort of sub-regional or regional way. But also we have to look at this institution from another point of view, not only from the geographical point of view, but we have to be clear that all of these new regions or sub-regions have had an history and are the result of compromises between different points of view, among different points of view in Latin America. If you take the CELAC was the result of a meeting called by Brazil of all Latin American countries in 2007, which was the expansion of the idea of South America in relation to Africa and to Africa, to include Cuba. And Mexico reacted and invited Cuba to be a member of the Rio Group, which had as one of its most important bases to be a democratic country. But at that point, from the Mexican point of view, prevailed the idea of not being again isolated from the South, as it was in UNASUR before. And therefore, we had at some moment two institutions that had the same members and the same objectives. So the two meetings led to the Cancun meeting, which was called the Meeting of the Unidad, and there was the creation of this CELAC. The interpretation of CELAC has been very different according to the countries. But no one wants to be out of that. And that's also a very important thing to be understood from, if you are thinking inter-American. That means that everyone is interested in destroying the inter-American system? I don't think so. I think that no country in Latin America wants to be isolated from the others. There is a cultural tradition, a sense of identity. In that sense, there is Latin America. It has no, perhaps more concrete result, but exists. And the decision of government tends to be, well, we have to be in. For what purpose? Well, that's the second point. That first we have to be in, and then we would reduce the scope of the activity of the institution. And this is the result of another situation that I would like to remember again, which was the creation of UNASUR, because UNASUR was the creation of Brazil. Brazil called for the South American conference in the period of President Cardoso. many countries in the region has doubt to exclude Mexico. Brazilians said that Mexico was already auto-excluded because of the pertinence to NAFTA. And finally, the South American idea grows around the question of infrastructure and energy, and that was accepted by everyone, but soon became again the idea of a more comprehensive institution. And in that institution, things led that was close to South America. But this South America has been mainly a product of a very active policy of Brazil, accepted by the others, in the same way that I was talking about the acceptance of CELAC. But this has very positive results in terms of, for instance, the creation of this body of ministers of defense. So when we were talking about, in the morning, about the defense ministerial, I would like to ask what is the relation, would be the relation between this defense ministerial and the South American Ministerial of Defense. Because now we cannot think in a vacuum. There is not only one institution. We would probably will have two. And we need to understand that and the interplay between institutions, which is very difficult and messy. Countries in presidents of Latin America tend to go to 6, 7, 8 summits in the year. And I bet that most of them don't know in what summit they are, because they have, well, they're the same faces. And sometimes one summit goes immediately after the other. But that is a reality. That's one way to do things, or not to do things, but that is part of the problem. If we don't see that and we don't reduce very clearly the objectives to your institution, you will end up having meetings without many content, which, and this is a cultural recognition, is not very difficult for Latin Americans. Well, I'm standing too much. I said that participation in the multiple regional and sub-regional groupings does not mean full-fledged support of their creation, but the necessity not to be seen as a dissident in the region. It is very difficult to understand why an issue is dealt with in a particular meeting when it would have been equally comprehensible to be treated in another institution. And we have to remember that there is other system working, which is the Ibero-American system, which is Spain, Portugal, and the Portuguese and Spanish-American countries. The system was increasing in importance, well, up to the crisis. I think that now the situation will diminish, but will not be abandoned. And we also have 17 ministerials or 15 ministerials, Ibero-American ministerials, where, of course, countries of different origins are not invited. Would it be possible to narrow the scope of inter-American issues and to concentrate efforts on those issues already agreed? Rethinking strategy will not mean agreeing on a set of objectives or desire. We can read hundreds of pages in inter-American resolution, but agreement is needed at least in significant fields to be addressed through negotiation and concrete programs. My impression is the last renewal of the inter-American system started with the Initiative of the Americas of President George Bush father and the Summit of the Americas with President Clinton, and lasted as a very powerful idea until Mar del Plata, when the idea of FTAA was abandoned. I'm not saying that the trade was the only element, but after Mar del Plata, we have not having any new ideas. And the last two summits, I'm afraid to say, is a very powerful proof of that. Ambassador Einaudi touched on the relation with the US and neighboring countries. I would say something that is rather obvious. Due to the particular nature of current transnational society, many problems are not national and could not be solved national. Therefore, some kind of cooperation is needed. But to cooperate in international scene, one needs at least to review its own practices and policies, and even to rethink how to apply its own values. The transnational drug trafficking problem and its associated issue, the transnational small arms trafficking, the important new threats to for the region, are inextricably linked to the relation between the United States, Mexico, and Central American countries. And the domestic politic answer is contradictory with the crucial subject of civil security for most of Latin America. If you have drug demands and availability of weapons, you will not solve the problem. And here, I think the inward-looking character of the United States politics, is a huge obstacle to the real solution of the problem. I'm not saying that is the only part of the problem, but it's a crucial component. I fully agree that the hemisphere cannot be insulated from global events. The idea of regions and sub-regions are not closed sub-regions or closed classification of countries, particularly of countries that have followed an open trade model that need to link with global market. The rapid growth of China and of Asia more generally made it a must to look at these markets. And to look at this market, we need to interact with their societies. Therefore, Latin America will be more linked to Asia. I'm going to say that sometimes it's for foreigners, and this time I'm not talking about the Americans, but about the Europeans. We had a meeting in Chile several years ago when I was in government, and at the lunch, one of the members of the commission said, "Why are you interested in China? You shouldn't be. Why is it? We are selling a lot to China, and China became our first trading partner. If we are selling copper, we are in the business of selling copper, we have to sell copper to the people that want to buy copper, and China was the country. And therefore, all this discussion that, well, I think has evaded a little bit about the Chinese presence in Latin America, I think is completely an overstatement. And China is not investing in Chile, for instance, but is having a very strong trade. More than that, I think that the United States took the idea of the Trans-Pacific Association, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, from an initiative that originally were created by Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile. And so the current negotiations are very important, and we have, unfortunately, only 2 of these open countries participating in the Trans-Pacific Partnership in Latin America, Chile and Peru. Mexico is still on hold because the USTR want to have first agreement in the framework, probably, but why not? It's not Mexico and Canada be part of this association now. I don't think we can play, if we are thinking strategically, in some small advantages in terms of, and not allowing all the members of the region that want to have something with Asia being part of this kind of association. It's the same situation that we had with Colombia, and I fully understand what went going on here in relation to the finishing of the free trade agreement with Colombia. But it took 2 summits to have this agreement finished. And I think my impression is that the main reason was that President Obama had to go to Colombia, because it has been unthinkable to go to a summit to Colombia without having this free trade agreement. So the United States has good ideas, but it's very slow to accomplish this element. And in the region, sometimes this led countries to lose interest in the ideas that were set. And I think that is another question that is important in inter-American relation. And I understand, and I agree with you that perhaps Latin America gets enough attention in terms of time from the United States. But I think what we need is better attention, not more attention. And we need to have more nuance in terms of how the policy is developed. The European crisis is of concern. In the Southern Cone is of a lot of concern because there is a lot of European investment, and particularly in my country, Spanish investment, and these are highly and significant part of our trade still directed toward Europe. European countries have played very positive role also in many of the inter-American institutions, things that is not recognized, especially in relation to the inter-American human rights system. To develop a new strategy for the Americas, we will need to consider the region and the subregions. They are linked with world affairs, and to find what are the issues that countries in the Western Hemisphere together are willing to tackle. The strengthening of inter-American institutions is a must. The US policy of hub and spokes that have prevailed from my point of view could be useful in a bilateral sense, but will not be able to reinforce a sense of community, not even a sense of a limited community. Ideas, policies, and programs should be the next step to reinforce multilateral institutions of the Hemisphere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. We have about 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes, and I think we'd like to get some, I have a number of comments, but I'd rather get, I'm sure there have been a lot of issues that have been put on the table by these three excellent presenters. Richard, you want to talk again? You want another question? Or another question? Okay. Why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to you, Richard. Do we have a microphone for? Yeah. Thanks.
The University of District of Columbia. In the remarks you made this morning, each of you, Canada is not there. Can you comment on this, please? How do you insert Canada in your comments?
Okay, thank you. Why don't we take some other questions? Is that okay? Richard, you want to go?
Thank you, Michael. I have been very interestingly following the dissertation of Mr. Portales and all of the other ones that have preceded him. And my question really in this opportunity is what do you think is the impact of that South Command in the hemispheric security strategy? I think we have not mentioned it in our talks.
Thank you. Another question, comment from anybody? Yes, we have a couple over here. Sir? Okay.
I'm the air attaché from El Salvador. Ambassador, you touched on, and Mr. Fisk, you touched on military cooperation, FMS, foreign military security assistance. It's more of a comment, but maybe you can touch on it. I think in the case of El Salvador and Colombia, military assistance is often stated as the foundation of that relationship. So as these countries are becoming more globally important, our influence with those countries, however it is politically, economically, or through military assistance, becomes more important because those votes on the UN, we might need those votes. So, you know, and you look at Saudi Arabia and Pakistan as other countries where military assistance has been key to our cooperation with them. So I guess I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the risks that you see if military cooperation is reduced, because that has been brought up, especially with our current budget crisis in the United States.
Thank you. You have another question here?
Hi, excuse me, Frederick Reservone. I run a small company now that works a lot in Latin America. And my question is based on having experienced many of the things you're talking about in the academic world as a policy practitioner in DoD and now in the private sector. And one of the things I'd like to hear about is a little bit about the role of the U.S. private sector in Latin America, but especially in high technology and in defense and security. And the second component of that is, how does that play with economic competitors to the United States in Latin America?
Thank you. One final question, and then we'll come back to...
Marilyn Rejala, de la Junta Interamericana de Defensa. Mi pregunta va dirigida al embajador Luigi Einaudi. Siguiendo una metáfora muy utilizada últimamente, o asumiendo que hoy día el enemigo común no tiene ya la forma de un gran y temible dragón, sino que se ha transformado en numerosas serpientes venenosas instaladas en nuestro propio jardín. ¿Se podrá enfrentar estas ya no tan nuevas amenazas sin el fortalecimiento, el mejoramiento de las relaciones civiles militares? Habida cuenta que esta mesa de panelistas, de célebres panelistas, ha reconocido que una forma efectiva de combatir estas amenazas es con el establecimiento de normas comunes. Y no tengo que recordarles quiénes dictan las normas. Muchísimas gracias.
Ambassador.
A wide range of questions. First of all, I did explicitly mention Canada. It is true, more from the standpoint of U.S. immediate interest as a país limítrofe, as our immediate neighbor. And I was very pleased that Secretary of Defense Panetta brought up in his report that he had just had the first trilateral meeting between the U.S., Canadian, and Mexican ministers of defense. In this strange world that we are now living in, I think it is essential to increase consultation and dialogue on many issues with as many countries as we can effectively manage, starting with our immediate neighbors and then extending to some of the other traditional allies. I did not bring up the presence of Canada in my comments, in part because I am so aware of the presence of Canada in this meeting, both in terms of one of the major paper writers, Professor Claypack, but also in terms of the sponsorship and support that General Thibault has given us. Canada is a very interesting country and an important country for the United States because it is not the United States and it has its own views of the world. Not being able to think of itself as a superpower, Canada thinks to begin with in terms of association with others, in terms of multilateral cooperation. It is, in the global jargon, a good global citizen. And that is of fundamental importance to the United States when it comes to some kind of multilateral cooperation. On Southern Command, we will hear from our keynoter, who is a very able man. He will talk about the role of Southern Command. Clearly, from the standpoint of the Department of Defense, Southern Command is the major instrument for relations with countries south of Mexico. It has to be worked out, and one of the big issues always has been in cooperation with the political agencies, or in what is said today, whole of government or interagency consensus or work. In my own experience, we never talk about Southern Command as having been involved in the Peru-Ecuador conflict, but without Southern Command, MOMEP would have been impossible. The logistical support of the Blackhawks would have been impossible. And more importantly, I think, professional communication with other militaries would have been impossible. So clearly, Southern Command has a very major and important role. Private sector. I'm a government person. I have spent my life as a public servant, whether it was working for the US government or working for the community. So inevitably, when we talk about policy, etc., at least in the old days, we thought about what government policies were, and clearly these needed to also be enabled to give the private sector more of a freedom and ability to pursue its interests. The technology field is a complicated one because it immediately crosses over between public and private because of the security issues, because of questions of intellectual property and secrecy and the like. It is my sense, again, in this complicated world in which we're living, where it is important to have institutional relationships, that the governmental side of the house has a responsibility in assisting, where possible, American companies to develop relationships that involve the transfer and utilization of technology with countries with which we want to have effective relations. There is absolutely no doubt that the relationship with Brazil, for example, will be very heavily influenced by US government policies on the transfer of technology, even when the American instrument, if you will, or agent involved in the transfer turns out to be private. I think the United States has an interest because, among other things, Brazil has an interest, and so do our competitors. And we need to be able to be effective and in developing positive relationships. I did not fully follow, con permiso, señora, su pregunta, in part because of my ears are not what they used to be, and in the echoes in this chamber, I sometimes don't hear things fully. The sense of the need for improving civil-military relations, I think, is fundamental. I am impressed with this conference because we are able to reach a significant number of our uniformed colleagues. I am sorry sometimes that we don't have more civilians present, even in terms of the United States, although those of you who haven't spotted him, he's hidden back behind there. Giovanni Snidel has been the lonely bearer of the State Department's ability to deal in all of the issues we're discussing. And I want to recognize Giovanni for being here and thank him for being here with us. So let me just stop there.
Well, we're about approaching the end. I think what I'd like to do is, to conclude is maybe just make 4 quick points just to end this, what I think has been a very rich and productive session. First, I want to take up on Dan's, I think, very good point about Colombia, which I think he's absolutely right. This is sort of an example of sustained commitment, a dozen years in Plan Colombia, and it's useful to think about Colombia was approved a year before 9/11. What would have happened if it had been considered after 9/11? In other words, is there any, given what Dan described, I think very accurately, about the kind of fatigue, the economic problems in the United States, is it still possible to have a sustained commitment? Let's say today, in the case of Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, is that even possible? Plan Colombia was only possible because it was a year before 9/11, and so it's just something to think about. The second point is related also to the United States. I think the real turning point was the financial crisis here in 2008. My sense from Latin America is that there's always been questions and criticisms raised about the United States and the way it's behaved sometimes, and it's been part of the debate. But what was really different, I think, about 2008 that's changed things in a permanent way was that the sense that the United States was no longer really able to manage its economic and affairs and keep its fiscal house in order. And in addition to that, rising inequality in the United States, whereas Latin Americans not only have seen declining poverty, but also declining inequality in a number of countries. That kind of sense of inability to manage economic affairs, the financial crisis, and the great prediction that went completely wrong, which was that when the financial crisis hit, the sense that this would be devastating for Latin America, with the exception of Mexico, which is very closely tied to the United States. The rest of Latin America did pretty well and weathered the crisis much better than anybody expected. To me, that was a shift in the relationship. Third point is the importance of Brazil and Mexico in sort of looking ahead. When we talk about trends, it's interesting to think what would have happened if Brazil had developed in a different way. We'd probably be talking about different kinds of trends in terms of the performance of the region, in terms of pragmatic politics. If Brazil had been different under the Lula government, perhaps that would have completely affected the whole regional outlook in significant ways. And then Mexico. Will Mexico in the coming years begin to play a broader regional and global role that it's played in recent years? Or will it continue to really be focused inward on its own very, very serious problems? We talked about the Central American situation 30 years ago. Mexico had a very different role to play in the regional picture than it does today. Will that come back, or is this basically, Mexico will just continue to be kind of inward-looking? But Mexico is a major power, and its role, I think, is something that we have to take into account to think about the future. And just by way of conclusion, the final point is I think this session has been extremely useful. It's been very sober, very realistic, very well-grounded, but not urgent. In other words, there's the sense that, well, Latin America is doing okay, the United States is doing okay. There is this, as Luigi rightly pointed out, this drift, some distancing, but that's okay. We don't have the great antagonisms or acrimony that existed in previous periods. And I think that is true, although it's risky. Because there could be a real serious crisis that requires urgent cooperation. And with that distancing and drift, there may not be the foundation to really cooperate. And that, I think, is the concern and the warning that we should heed. There are lots of possibilities in terms of economic crises. One can imagine political scenarios in a number of countries and subregions that can get very complicated. that will demand cooperation. And if we have this distancing and drift that's been described, fragmentation that Luigi captured very well in his comments, then we may be in trouble down the line. So that just underscores the importance of better cooperation. I think I'll leave it at that. I want to thank all of you, and I want to thank the excellent remarks that Luigi made, and also the fine commentary, very thoughtful, by Dan Fisk and Carlos Portales. Thank you all very much. I think this was a terrific scene setter for the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Michael, thank you. Thank you, panel. We are going to go through a little test of flexibility here. The caterer is en route, hasn't gotten here yet. So what I propose to do, Admiral, is to take a short break and then give you an opportunity to speak, and we'll do it here. Your slides here, you're all set, not a problem. And then after the Admiral speaks and a little question and answer session with him, we will move over to Marshall Hall and have some lunch. So that's the plan. Would you all take about a 10-minute break and listen to the cowbell, and we'll come back here and we'll press on.
Yeah. Very complicated stuff. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for your... How are you, sir? Yeah. Yeah, no, Dude, how are you? Good. Well, thank you. I can, yes. Actually, believe it or not, the OAS website seems to have crashed over the weekend, but I'm sure it will come back, and as soon as I have access to a computer that I can... Yeah, I think I'm probably, shouldn't I be in the program here? Let me see what... No, but there's a second sheet in here. Let's just see. Because